So good day, friends. Dr. Bob Hamilton, and you have tuned in today to the Hamilton Review, where kids and culture collide. This is a podcast, I hope, where you can find content that is interesting, relevant, and compelling to the point that we will act on it and maybe change something that you're doing in your life and at least think about what you're doing with your kids. And that's why I have this podcast. And so I thank you for tuning in. It means a lot to me. I know that every one of you out there who are listening to this podcast today are engaged in life. You're doing all the things we all do. You're running around chasing kids. You're going to soccer practices. You're getting ready for tomorrow. You're making lunches, all the things that parents do, going to work, putting your kids to bed, all that stuff. So it means a lot that you're taking a moment of your life to listen to this podcast. And I promise that today you will be glad that you tuned in, because today is an incredible privilege to welcome to my show a very prominent member of the medical community, Dr. James Moran. He's an Ob-Gyn. He's been in the Santa Monica area for 50 years, practiced for 50 years in Santa Monica. Amazing feat. He has delivered approximately 10,000 children. So some of you out there listening to this podcast were delivered by Dr. Moran. and by the way, Jim, I think you delivered a couple of my kids as well. So you've made a mark in the Hamilton family. So Dr. Moran, it's a pleasure to welcome you today to the Hamilton Review.
Well, thank you for having me.
It's my pleasure. So what I like to do, as all the listeners of this podcast know, is I generally stop talking at this point and I turn the microphone over to my guest. And so, Jim, I'm going to do that. And I'd like you to just kind of back up and tell a little bit about your story, your journey, those moments of inspiration and that caused you to become the icon of Santa Monica and Ob-Gyn for over 50 years. So, Dr. James Moran, the microphone belongs to you.
Okay. Well, I started off life in Ireland, in a little town called Tuam, which is Gaelic for tomb, and it's on the west coast of Ireland in Galway. And my mother was a nurse who was trained actually in the United States. She came with her sister, my Aunt Helen, and they both took a ship from Ireland to the United States and started a nursing school in Brooklyn. Both became nurses. And my mother went back to Ireland, married my father. Soon after that, I had my sister, and then 4 years later had me. And my mother worked at the Galway Regional Hospital, which is basically a county hospital in that area. And unfortunately contracted tuberculosis and actually died 2 years after I was born. And then my father, who basically was a mechanic, worked at a factory where he repaired and took care of machines in the factory. He contracted tuberculosis also and ended up being hospitalized for a year and a half and subsequently died. So my sister and I were left without any parents, and for very strange reason, I'm not sure what they were thinking of, but the family sent my sister to live with the maternal side of the family, the Burkes, and I was sent to live with the Moran side. Now, this was during World War II. Even though Ireland was not officially in it, a lot of course, Irish men fought in the British Army. So times were tough. Of course, they still had the problems with the recession, etc. And so apparently neither family decided that they could take us. So we ended up going to separate orphanages. My sister went to one that was run by nuns, and she basically went to school there. I was sent to a place called the St. Joseph Industrial Home for Boys. Now, there's a big scandal in Ireland about these industrial homes. They were homes that boys were sent who were either criminals or abandoned or basically unwanted. And so I was sent there, I think around age 4 or 5, and I was there till I was 8. Now, for some strange reason, even though it was run by the Catholic Church, I never went to school. I'm not sure what we did. We did grow things in the fields, but I don't remember working too hard. I think basically they just had a place for us to live. Anyway, subsequently, these industrial homes were closed due to physical and sexual abuse problems, which apparently had been going on for years. Fortunately, if anything like that occurred, I do not remember it, thank God. All I remember is that I was there. At the end of World War II, my Aunt Helen discovered that her sister, my mother, and her brother-in-law had died. And so a friend of hers was visiting Ireland now that travel could resume. And she said, well, stop in and look at the relatives and see how the two children are doing. So she discovered that we were in orphanages, came to the orphanages, then informed my Aunt Helen, who lived in Brooklyn and was still working as a nurse. She arranged through a doctor, a friend who also was a congressman, to put us on the list to come to the United States as immigrants. In those days, you couldn't just walk across the border like some people do today, but it took 3 years for all the paperwork. And my sister and I arrived. We flew by plane, in a 2-engine plane that took 13 hours, and landed at LaGuardia Airport.
Wow.
And my first thing that I did, I was interviewed by a newspaper man from the Irish Echo, which was an Irish-American newspaper. And he asked me, well, son, what do you think of the United States? And I immediately barfed because I had been treated royally by the flight attendants who fed us with all sorts of interesting things that I had never eaten. And anyway, that was my introduction to the United States.
That's an interesting way to start your American life. Okay.
But my aunt was an interesting lady. She had only gotten married at the end of World War II, as my uncle had been in the army, and she was 46 years old when she got married. She conceived twins.
Wow.
And they spontaneously aborted.
Hmm.
And it was right at this time that she found out about us. So my sister and I, replaced those twins.
Wow.
Anyway, so okay, and we lived in Brooklyn, and everything was hunky-dory. and my aunt signed me up for the local Catholic school, which was Our Lady of Perpetual Help. We used to call it OLPH, Our Lady's Poorhouse, but um, she discovered on my passport there was a picture there of me, and it said "bear unable to write." And she said, "Jimmy, you do know how to write, don't you?" I said, "No." She said, "You know how to read, don't you?" I said, "No." She said, "You've been to school, haven't you?" I said, "No." So here I was signed up for the third grade. I had 2 weeks before school started. So I had a crash course in reading and writing and arithmetic and learned how to read in that period of
Wow,
time.
amazing. Okay.
Shows you that at the age of 8, if you have, I guess, have half a decent brain, you could do anything.
Yeah. No, I think at 8, you're actually very ready and you're probably sopping up like a wet sponge. And that's amazing. So you learned how to read in 2 weeks.
Now, my uncle was very smart. He would buy these books that were definitely for boys. I remember reading Tarzan of the Apes, Flash Gordon, The Lone Ranger, a lot of things that little boys would like. And they would have a picture on one side and text on the other. And I think the books only cost like 50 cents. Um, but I started reading, and it was a whole new world to me because, of course, we didn't have a television set in those days. We did have a radio, but there was nothing on radio for children really in those days. And so it was a whole world that just opened up before my eyes. And I read so voraciously that my uncle finally said, "We have to take you to the library to get a library card." He said, "I can't afford to keep buying all these books." Anyway, my first teacher
But
was
by
an
the way,
Irish.
if I can interrupt here for one
Yeah,
second. By the way, Dr. Moran is still an avid reader. Every time I saw him in the hospital when he wasn't delivering babies, he was reading. He was reading books, and he gave me a lot of good tips of books along this journey of our relationship. So something happened, Jim. I can see that little boy that learned how to read never quite was quelled. Right? You're still at it today because
right.
you read a lot.
I
So
read a lot, yes.
so we'll get to that a little bit later. I want to talk a little bit more about that. But anyway, I interrupted you.
So anyway, my first teacher was an Irish nun. Now in the classroom, there was 75 boys. Now we all wore white shirts and blue ties and blue pants, and we all sat there. There was no teacher's aide. The only aid that the teacher had was a long stick, which was occasionally used to emphasize a point. My first report card, which was only like a month or so after starting, I failed reading, writing, arithmetic, but I passed hygiene and attendance. Now, my uncle was very upset, aunt and uncle were very upset that I had failed anything. So I was confined to home Mondays to Fridays and said I had to spend the time and study harder and harder. I had to memorize the times table, etc. My uncle was a bookkeeper, accountant. And the next report card I had in those days they used numbers. All my grades were in the 90s. So I was allowed to then play if I didn't have any homework.
So you
Um,
went from Fs, all Fs, to basically A's
right.
in one quarter. Not bad. That was kind of a quick start there. Incredible.
Well, my aunt and uncle impressed upon me that if I wanted to succeed in life, that I had to be educated. that was the most important thing. My uncle had gone to college, but only for 2 years, so he was not a full-fledged accountant. And he always regretted not finishing his uh, thing. He was also from Ireland. Anyway, spent the years in grammar school and ended up being captain of the crossing guards and things like that. But then the eighth grade, um, I had the opportunity to apply to various high schools. And there was one nun who was my teacher in the eighth grade, said that she thought that I could get into a high school called Regis High School, which is a Jesuit high school in Manhattan. And it is unique in that it was founded in 1914 and accepted approximately 100 plus students per year and charged no tuition. And it has never charged any tuition since its inception in 1914. And knowing that my aunt and uncle didn't really have that much money, she said, "I think you should take the test." And so I took the test, fortunately passed it, and was accepted into the school, and was the only one in my class that was accepted. And I then started taking the subway, and it took an hour each way on the subway every day for 4 years, and went to this high school, which was fantastic high school for me. It was very classically oriented. We had, 4 years of Latin, 3 years of Greek, 2 years of French, 4 years of math, 4 years of history. It was really a very intense high school, and yet enjoyable too. They also were very, very strict. You were not allowed to walk around with your hands in your pocket. Only hoodlums did that. Uh, you had to have a proper haircut. In fact, in my very first year, I was approached by the dean of discipline, a Father Brown, who said, "Moran, is there a tonsorial parlor in your neighborhood?" I didn't know what that was. I said, "I don't know what it is." He said, "Otherwise known as a barber shop." He said, "I expect that you will visit there this afternoon and then come into my office at 7:30 tomorrow morning, and I want to see a proper haircut."
Wow. Okay.
So the next morning I was there with a crew cut. So
So we could
uh,
probably use a couple Father Browns in our public schools these
oh
days, James.
yeah. Yeah, the discipline was what was interesting too, though. If you did something wrong in class or failed to do a homework assignment, you were required to go to what they called JUG, JUG, which they called Jesuit Undergraduate Guidance. So you would have to go to another classroom, and there after school, and you would get an assignment. Now, the assignments were varied, but quite commonly they would ask you to memorize a poem. And you couldn't go home until you had recited the poem to the priest that was in charge. And so I I had to memorize parts of the rhyme of the Ancient Mariner, um, the Raven by Edgar Allan Poe.
That's right.
I still remember quite a few of the lines.
That's right. Quote the quote
After a
quote the
while, though,
Raven. Quote the Raven. Nevermore. Right.
right? Um, After a while, you got to know the system, though. I realized that the priest had to finish by 5:30 because he had to go to supper. So what I would end up doing, as a lot of my friends did, after several visits to Jug, we would do our homework. And then at 5:30, priest would look around and say, okay, Moran, close the windows, let's turn out the lights, go home. So I ended up uh, getting my homework done quite early sometimes. Anyway, it was very, very good years. Actually, one of my classmates was Tony Fauci, the famous Dr. Anthony
Sure,
Fauci
sure.
of
So
NIH fame.
he was in your grade.
Yeah.
So you know Tony Fauci pretty well then.
Yeah, I have, of course, have not seen him for a long, long time. But yeah,
Wow.
it, with only 100 students in the class, you got to know everybody.
Oh, for sure. Yeah. Amazing. I did not know that, James. Interesting.
And anyway, then I I applied to 2 colleges for pre-med, because by that time I had definitely decided I wanted to go into medicine. And I applied to 2 local colleges in New York, got accepted to both, and I went to Fordham University, which is also another Jesuit university. And I chose them because they gave me the most money.
Okay.
So it
That's
was a
right.
simple, practical reason.
You became
But again,
you became an American capitalist pretty quickly, James. So
exactly.
let me back up 1 second. Why medicine? You were pretty young to be thinking medicine at that level of your education.
Well, there was a couple of reasons. One, my aunt was a nurse, and she was the head of the operating room of the hospital where she worked. And so every day she would regale me with stories about the patients that they had operated on. And of course, that to me was very interesting. And also, the summer between grammar school and high school, I actually went back to Ireland for the whole summer to visit my uncle's relatives in the town of Tipperary. And I spent the 8 weeks there. And I had an assignment from the high school I was going to, that I had to read 8 books, 4 of whom were Charles Dickens novels, and another one was Johnny Tremain, Huckleberry Finn. And it was interesting. It was only years later that I looked back on the books that they assigned me, and they all had to do with orphans.
Hmm. Wow.
Johnny Tremain, Huckleberry Finn, David Copperfield, Oliver Twist, Little Nell from the old Curiosity Shop. All were children that were either abandoned or orphaned somehow. And I never got to ask actually any of my classmates if they got assigned the same books.
Hmm.
I just assumed we all got the same books, but I'm not sure. Anyway, while I was in Ireland, we got to visit a racing training stable. And while I was there, there was a veterinarian there, and there was a horse in labor. And so he looked at me and said, son, you want to help me deliver this colt? And I said, sure. So he said, okay, roll up your sleeves. And he said, put your hand inside, start pulling. So I delivered a colt. And then he checked again. And he said, well, we got another one. So I delivered twin colts. So that was my first experience with
Oh
obstetrics.
my gosh! What a story. Okay.
So
So
I was just ecstatic. Interestingly enough, everybody there was very upset because apparently twin racing horses, thoroughbred horses, do not become good racers.
oh,
They might be
okay.
beautiful horses, but they don't have the drive, I guess, or whatever. Uh, but I didn't care. I was so excited. Anyway, so that was my first experience there. Um, When I started, I went through 4 years of pre-med in Fordham, and um, I applied to several medical schools in New York, but I wanted to get out of New York City because I thought if I become a doctor, go to medical school in New York, I'll end up doing a residency there. I'll end up being a New York doctor. And there was a whole world that I wanted to see. But I was also, again, being very capitalistic. There was a State University of New York uh, that was like the UC system.
Yeah.
The tuitions were a lot cheaper. The University of Buffalo had just become the State University of New York at Buffalo, and their medical school accepted me. So I went there. Buffalo is basically a very miserable place. I would never advise anybody to go live there, but it was a good place to learn because there was nothing much else to do. But tuition there was $800 a semester.
Wow.
And Nelson Rockefeller had instituted a program when he was a governor in New York called the Scholar Incentive Award. And if you had the grades and the need, you could get up to $700 a semester off. So medical school cost me $100 a semester.
Wow. Okay. That's a pretty good deal.
So when I graduated, I had zero debt,
Amazing.
which
Okay.
is really fantastic.
Which is, by the way, quite different than the poor graduates who are coming out today who are
Oh,
looking at hundreds of thousands of dollars in debt. But that's another conversation. But well, you're very fortunate to be able to walk out with a medical degree with zero debt.
right.
So amazing.
I mean, I was incredibly lucky. Yeah. Now, the reason I chose, now I had to apply for internship, and several of the people that I had been ahead of me in Buffalo had gone to Los Angeles County General Hospital, part of USC, and they had raved about it. And I had 4 years of miserable cold, snow, and sleet in Buffalo, and I wanted to go someplace nice and warm. And so I applied to LA County for internship, sight unseen. I never did get to see it until I was accepted. And meanwhile, in my senior year, I had gotten married. Um, I'm not sure why I chose to get married while I was still in school, um, but we did, and somehow we survived. Um, anyway, we drove across country to LA County, and I did a rotating internship, which is an internship that I don't think they even offer anymore. But
Yeah.
basically, you could take a month, a month of this, a month of that. And at the time, while I was in medical school, I had joined the United States Navy, um, mainly because I felt that I owed my country something.
Oh, okay.
And so I thought I will at least do my military duty, um, because there were inklings of the uh, Vietnam War starting at that time. This was 1966. So became a rotating intern. And it was, I found medical school to be very hard. I mean, I had to really study my rear end off. But the last 2 years, of course, were working in the hospital wards. And I found that there I seemed to shine, whereas I just did okay with the first 2 years. Um, and I found that to be sort of heartwarming that at least I seem to excel when dealing with actual patients. Anyway, with the internship, my first assignment was internal medicine. The very first month that I worked, 9 of my patients had died,
Wow.
which was a shock
Yeah.
because the reason I remember it is that we got autopsies on all of them, and I would have to go down to the autopsy and observe. And I remember the pathologist remarking, he said, "Oh, this is our busiest time when all the new interns come."
Yeah.
Anyway,
Mortality
so
goes up in the
I had
hospital. Okay.
I
Yeah.
had a month of pediatrics, orthopedics. Um, One of the most interesting ones was the month of IOB was called infected obstetrics. Now, this was before Roe versus Wade, and abortion was, of course, illegal. And we used to see uh, young women come in who had either attempted to abort themselves or had someone else abort them. And I saw young girls as old as 14 and women in their 40s who had attempted to abort themselves and unfortunately would get infected. And I actually saw quite a few die. One woman was only 17, had douched with Lysol, thinking that it was a disinfectant. So, of course, that would prevent her from getting an infection. And she
Wow.
developed a thing called methemoglobinemia
Yeah.
and died. So
Wow.
it was
Yeah. That's
horrible,
intense. Yeah.
horrible experience. But it was, I mean, a good experience as far as learning what to do. The very first night, actually, on that service, I asked the resident, uh, I said, Dr. So and so, I would like to learn how to do a D&C. I started at 8 o'clock in the morning. By midnight, I had already done 12. That was how busy we all were. Anyway, uh, finished that month of internship. And by when I walked up as a new intern, I was deathly afraid that I wouldn't be able to handle anything. By the end of the 12 months, I felt I could handle anything, or at least if I couldn't do it, I could refer it to somebody who could.
Yeah.
It was a good feeling.
No,
So then I went
I
to the,
think that I remember the terror I felt when I became an intern in pediatrics, and people would actually address me as doctor, which was that was the beginning of the terror. I go, no, I'm not really a doctor. No, you are a doctor, and the nurse would say, no, you're Dr. Hamilton. And I
yeah.
remember feeling that I felt tremendous anxiety. Um, and somehow it's like I think when you become a parent, you kind of grow into the responsibility. And I totally agree with you. After the first year, you kind of go, okay, I think I'm getting into the groove of this whole thing, and I'm beginning to understand things.
Right.
Um, so so after your rotating internship, and so you typically, friends, in terms of what a rotating internship is that you haven't really committed yourself to one particular uh, area of expertise. You do pediatrics, you do surgery, you kind of rotate through the hospital in different services. So then you decided OB-GYN. Tell us a little bit about that decision.
Well, after delivering babies while I was the month on obstetrics, I enjoyed every delivery so much that I started thinking, why, if I could do this for the rest of my life and get paid for it, that's that's the best of both worlds. And so I decided that of all them, because being exposed to all the other things, general surgery, orthopedics, urology, pediatrics, I realized that they were all interesting, but they weren't as much fun as obstetrics
Yeah.
was.
Yeah.
So then, of course, I had to go into the Navy, and I told them that I was interested in OB/GYN. So they put me on an all-male base. I was attached to the United States Marine Corps, uh, and my very first day, they said there was two other fellows and myself. We started uh, all having finished either internship or one had finished a residency. They said, "Okay, Moran, you are in charge of the emergency room, X-ray, and the pharmacy." And I just said, "Aye, aye, sir." And I thought, "Oh my God, how can I do this?" But fortunately, with the help of people that were there and that worked there for years, uh, all the Navy personnel, I learned what to do. And it was a great experience. We would see basically sick call for the Marines who were in training. There are two training bases for Marines in the United States. One is Paris Island in the Carolinas, and one is MCRD in San Diego. Now, when I was very talk about luck, when I was getting my assignment for the Navy, I appeared before the desk of this officer, and I looked at the ring on his finger, and he had a ring from Fordham University where I had gone. And it turned out he was a couple of years ahead of me, and we had similar teachers. And he said, "Well, where would you like to be assigned?" So I said, "I'd like to go to Honolulu." He said, "Well, we can't get that. Yeah. How about San Diego?" I said, "I'll take it." So that's how I got to go to the Marine base. Again, another just stroke of luck. Um, but we were told that we were supposed to be what they call roosters, that we would be there for approximately 3 months to learn basically Navy medical life. And then we would be shipped to Vietnam to go work there. So my wife at the time was pregnant with our first child. And I had told her that maybe she should go back to New York, be with her family, because it was very likely that I would. She said, "Well, let's just wait and see." Anyway, time went on. We had our first child. My my only daughter was delivered at the Naval Hospital the very first year I was in the Navy. And a year went by, uh, and I was invited to visit the commanding officer's house, and we sat down with cocktails. And I finally had enough nerve to ask him, "Sir, why is it that my two associates and myself are still here when we were told we were going to go to Vietnam?" He said, "Oh, very, very simple." He said, "The three of you worked so well together. You never complained. You did an outstanding job. And," he said, "I called up Washington, D.C., he said, 'Screw everybody else. I'm keeping these three.'" And they sent the others to Vietnam.
Wow.
So now, while I was in the Navy, I was on call every 14th night. Coming out of internship, where I was on every other night,
Yeah. Yeah. Every 14 nights sounds like a holiday to me.
it really was. And so, you didn't get very paid very much in the service. And so I decided that maybe I could get a moonlighting job. There was an opening for a psychiatrist at UC San Diego University Hospital. So I applied for, they just needed somebody to work at night. So I applied for the job, and they asked what my qualifications were. And I said, well, I went to medical school. I did have a month of psychiatry in the locked ward at LA County Hospital. They said, good enough, you're the psychiatrist. So I worked every fifth night as admitting psychiatrist to UC San Diego. It was really quite interesting. I dealt with a lot of people who had, tried to commit suicide, but failed. Um, my only job was to make a decision as to whether they were a danger to themselves or to others. And then I would hand it over to the day staff. My very first patients in that thing was a young married couple who were thinking of leaving each other. The husband said he was going to kill himself if his wife left. The wife said that she would kill herself if he didn't leave. And I'm sitting there thinking, oh my God, what can I do? So I just sat there in this rocking chair and I said, well, what do you think? And then what do you think? And back and forth. And the next thing I knew, at the end of the hour, they were kissing and hugging each other, and turned around and said, thank you so much, Dr. Moran. I went, but I realized that psychiatry was not what
Yeah, no,
I wanted to do.
I came to that conclusion as well. My outcomes weren't quite as beatific as that. That's quite a way to go, Jim. So I'm watching our time here, and I have a couple of questions for you. You ended up going into practice in Santa Monica ultimately. 50 years. I don't think there's any OB-GYN that I know in Santa Monica who practiced for 50 years. Are you the only one? Is that your understanding?
Yeah, I may be. I don't know for sure. I had the opportunity to work with Dr. Blake Watson,
Sure.
who was the first chairman of OB-GYN at St. John's, and he was chairman for 24 years. Um, I ended up being chairman for 7 years, which was a mere drop in the bucket to his. But I admired him so much, and I ended up uh, uh, inheriting a lot of his practice. He had an interesting practice where he took care of a lot of people, a lot of movie stars, very prominent people, and he also took care of housekeepers, people who had no money. And I remember in those days, of course, now you have to charge what the insurance companies will tell you to charge, but in those days, he charged whatever he wanted. And if he would charge based on what he thought that the patient would pay. So if they were very wealthy or very prominent, he would charge several $1,000s to take care of them. If there were a housekeeper, he would charge like $200 for the entire obstetrical care and delivery.
Wow. Boy, oh boy.
But what he would do is he treated, I watched him as he would do this. He would treat each patient as if they were the famous movie star. And I thought that was such a wonderful way to treat patients.
Yeah.
That every single patient was the one patient that you should take care of.
Yeah.
Uh,
So I missed Blake Watson. I know his reputation when I came into Santa Monica, and I think I missed him. I think I met him once or twice. He has he's the only guy so far who has a portrait in labor and delivery at St. John's. When you
right.
walk into St. John's and you're having a baby, you look up and there's Blake Watson, a beautiful portrait of him on the wall. He made a huge mark at St. John's, and I think James, you You are right next to him. We should get a portrait of you and hang it up there too. So as we finish off here, and we are going to finish friends with Dr. Moran. Although I have to say I am fascinated by your stories. You took care of. You delivered 10,000. You probably took care of thousands and thousands, many thousands of gals who were going to have a baby. Any comments that you want to make about what do you do when you're pregnant? Any thoughts about recommendations, preparations? What kind of advice would you render?
Well, fortunately, most of the patients that I came across seemed to be well educated and had read a lot already before even coming to me. But the one thing that impressed me in my career is diet and avoidance of certain things. When I was in training in medical school and internship and residency, I saw a lot of birth defects. I have delivered personally many anencephalics where the baby was delivered with basically half a brain.
Yeah. Yep.
And they, such tragic things. I actually delivered one baby that was labeled a cyclops. It had one eye in the middle of the forehead. Um, and when I started private practice, I never saw any of those. And I realized that it was proper diet, taking prenatal vitamins with folic acid, things like that,
Sure.
prevented so many things. And fortunately, most of my patients were very interested in doing things properly. If they smoked, they stopped smoking when they were pregnant. If they drank alcohol, they did not drink when they were pregnant. Uh, I I don't remember dealing with anybody who was using, um, marijuana, which may be a problem now. But if there were, they certainly didn't do it while they were pregnant. I did have one interesting patient who shows you what she came to me. She was the wife of a prominent banker. She'd had 6 miscarriages in a row. And I delivered, I took care of her and she lost a baby at like 6 months. She came in to see me and said, Dr. Moran, do you think it could be the heroin? I almost fell on the floor. I go, what do you mean, the heroin? She was using heroin daily, and I had no clue.
Wow.
She would inject in between toes and things like that, places that I never looked. She never did it on her arms because she was the wife of a prominent person that she knew enough to be able to hide it. So, in my wisdom, I said, well, a good start would be let's stop the heroin.
Okay.
And so amazingly, she did. She went through rehab. She got pregnant again, and I delivered her first child.
Beautiful.
So
Wow.
it was really an incredible thing. So, but it just goes to show you, it's just, I mean, I really think that women today are so lucky that we know so much about what keeps babies healthy,
Yeah.
basic nutrition,
No, I find that, and I share the population with you, James, is saying I catch the babies after you deliver them. And no, our moms in this community are amazingly aware. They, in addition to good, vitamins and diet, they also exercise. A lot of gals are out there walking and taking care of themselves, swimming, doing different things aerobically. And the vast majority of our deliveries are actually very successful. I mean, and they're usually it's rare to have In different countries around the world, I spend, as you know, a lot of time on the medical field, in the mission field out there in different countries, and routinely every time I go on a medical mission, I end up dealing with a child whose mother has passed during labor, and for various reasons, infections or whatever, or hemorrhage, and that almost never happens in certainly in Santa Monica, but in the U.S. in general, it's a rare event.
Yes, that's very, very true. During my training, I saw a lot of women die, and it's such a rare thing in private practice. And I think a lot of it is just because of the good care that, fortunately, we were able to give. People in the United States don't realize how lucky they are.
Yeah. No, I think that is one of those things that we battle with this whole thing of immunizations, because immunizations, we give them for a reason. Polio is a real phenomenon, and the reality is a lot of people don't realize it. They've never seen a polio victim. I had one in my family. My uncle had polio. And so we don't appreciate the blessings we have in America, and the healthcare we have here is just incredible. Well, listen, Jim, I can't tell you how happy I am that you were able to come in and be on my show today. It makes me very happy. And I just as we close here, I just want to say that Dr. Moran is indeed an icon in Santa Monica. He is known and beloved by thousands and thousands and thousands of people in this community, has had a very intimate role, obviously, in the delivery of what we said, approximately 10,000 babies. That's a whole population. That's a whole town, James. And your legacy is going to live on, Jim, and I think you know that at some level. And I wish you the very best now that you have retired officially. I went to the party. So I think you told me that at the party you said, well, I'm going back to the hospital. I'm on call tonight. And I go, James, you're retired. He goes, well, I got one more shift to do. But anyway, I wish you the very best. And I mean that. I hope you get to travel and do things that you want to do, read more books. And I thank you so much for being on the Hamilton Review today.
Well, thank you so much for having me.
It's been a pleasure. Okay, so friends, you have tuned in today to the Hamilton Review, where kids and culture collide. We've had a walk down memory lane with Dr. James Moran. Fascinating story. And Jim, you've done well. Well done, my friend. You've come a long way from your days as an orphan in Ireland. I can tell you that. So I'm very, very, very happy for you. So friends, until next time, be well, be encouraged. We'll see you then. Bye-bye.
You have been listening to the Hamilton Review, where kids and culture collide. Thank you for allowing us to be a part of your day. Tune in again next week on Apple Podcast. Rate and comment and tell a friend.